Imagine boarding a flight you paid full price for, settling into your hard-earned first-class seat, only to be told to give it up for someone else, simply because of the color of your skin. That's exactly what happened to Black CEO David Wellington on a routine trip. But what happened just 5 minutes later left the entire crew without jobs and the internet buzzing with disbelief. The champagne flute trembled in David Wellington's hand as the flight attendant's words cut through the refined murmur of first-class conversation like a blade through silk. "Sir, I'm going to need you to gather your belongings and move to coach." The crystal stem felt impossibly fragile between his fingers, much like the composure he'd spent 38 years perfecting. Around him, the plush leather seats of Delta Flight 447 to Chicago seemed to shrink, the ambient lighting suddenly harsh against his dark skin. The attendant, a middle-aged woman with artificially blonde hair pulled into a severe bun, stood with her hands clasped, her smile as plastic as the safety demonstration card tucked in the seat pocket. Ready for the complete story? Smash that subscribe button and tell me where you are tuning in from in the comments. Tomorrow brings another mind-blowing story that's just as unbelievable. Trust me, you will want to be here for it. All right, let's jump into it. David set down the champagne with deliberate care, his MBA from Wharton and the weight of running a Fortune 500 company feeling meaningless in this moment. "Excuse me? There's been a mix-up with the seating arrangements," she continued, her voice carrying that particular tone of false politeness that David had encountered too many times in boardrooms and country clubs. "A premium passenger needs this seat." The irony wasn't lost on him. Just 3 hours earlier, David had been featured on the cover of Forbes, hailed as the visionary who revolutionized green technology. His company, Wellington Innovations, had just secured a $2.4 billion contract to supply renewable energy solutions to major cities across the Midwest. He was literally flying to Chicago to sign the final papers that would create thousands of jobs and transform entire communities. Yet here he sat, being asked to surrender his rightfully purchased first-class seat. "I have my boarding pass right here," David said quietly, reaching into his Italian leather briefcase. His fingers found the crisp paper, Seat 2A, first class, paid for at full price with his personal credit card. "And my confirmation email." The flight attendant barely glanced at the documents. "I understand, sir, but we need to accommodate another passenger. We can upgrade you to premium economy at no charge." David's jaw tightened. Through the cabin window, he caught a glimpse of his reflection, a successful black man in a $3,000 Tom Ford suit, about to be humiliated in front of a cabin full of strangers. He thought of his daughter, Zoe, away at Harvard, and how he'd always taught her to stand up for herself with dignity, even when the world tried to diminish her. "And who exactly is this premium passenger?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm building in his chest. Before the attendant could answer, David heard the commotion behind him. A loud voice carried from the jetway. "Well, it's about time. I specifically requested an aisle seat up front. I have very important business in Chicago, and I'm not sitting in the back with." The voice belonged to a man in his 50s, red-faced and sweating despite the air conditioning, wearing a rumpled golf polo that stretched across his substantial belly. Behind him walked a woman David assumed was his wife, clutching a designer handbag and looking around first class with the entitled air of someone who believed the world owed her comfort. "Mr. Richardson," the flight attendant said with genuine warmth, a stark contrast to her tone with David. "Right this way. We've sorted everything out for you." Richardson's eyes swept over David with undisguised disdain. "Good. I was wondering what was taking so long." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. David wasn't being moved for operational reasons or legitimate booking errors. He was being moved because someone had made a phone call, pulled strings, or simply complained loudly enough that the crew decided it was easier to displace the black passenger than to deal with an entitled white customer's demands. But what none of them knew, not the attendant, not Richardson, not anyone on this flight, was that David Wellington wasn't just any passenger. He was the majority shareholder in Delta's parent company, a fact he'd learned just 2 weeks ago when his investment firm had quietly acquired a controlling interest as part of a larger portfolio expansion. As David slowly rose from his seat, his mind was already 3 moves ahead, calculating not just his next action, but the consequences that would ripple through every level of this airline. The crew had no idea they had just made the most expensive seating mistake in aviation history. Richardson was already settling into seat 2A, his wife taking 2B, both of them acting as if displacing another passenger was as routine as ordering coffee. The flight attendant busied herself with offering them premium champagne and warm towels, her attention completely focused on her new important passengers. David gathered his briefcase, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Around him, other first-class passengers averted their eyes, some looking uncomfortable, but none speaking up. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rustle of newspapers and the clink of glassware as the crew continued their service. But as David prepared to step into the aisle, something unexpected happened. A voice from the back of the first-class cabin spoke up. "Excuse me, but I couldn't help but notice what just happened here." Every head turned toward the source. A woman in her early 30s with striking auburn hair and intelligent green eyes, wearing a crisp white blazer that suggested both authority and purpose. She was rising from her seat in row 5, and there was something about her posture, her tone, that commanded immediate attention. "And you are?" the flight attendant asked, her smile faltering slightly. The woman reached into her jacket and pulled out a leather credential holder. "Sarah Chun, Federal Aviation Administration. I'm traveling on official business, and I believe I just witnessed a clear violation of federal anti-discrimination regulations." The cabin fell silent. Even Richardson stopped fussing with his seatbelt, his face draining of color. The flight attendant's plastic smile completely disappeared. David paused in the aisle, his hand still gripping his briefcase handle. The game had just changed completely, and he had a feeling this flight to Chicago was about to become far more interesting than anyone had anticipated. The question was, what would happen in the next 5 minutes that would change everything? David Wellington had built his empire on the principle that information was power, and right now he was calculating exactly how much power he held in this aluminum tube at 35,000 feet. As he stood in the aisle, briefcase in hand, his mind wasn't on the humiliation or the injustice. It was on the intricate web of corporate relationships that had led to this moment. The truth was, David's acquisition of controlling shares in Delta's parent company hadn't been random. It had been strategic, part of a larger vision to revolutionize how major corporations approached environmental responsibility. His daughter Zoe had challenged him during their last dinner together at Harvard, asking why he was content to simply build green technology when he could force entire industries to adopt it. "Dad," she'd said, cutting into her salmon with the precision she'd inherited from him, "you can't change the world by being nice to the systems that are broken. Sometimes you have to own them." At 18, Zoe possessed a moral clarity that both inspired and humbled him. She'd grown up watching her father navigate boardrooms where he was often the only black face, where his ideas were questioned twice as hard and his successes attributed to luck rather than brilliance. She'd also watched him rise above it all with grace, building Wellington Innovations into a company that now employed over 50,000 people worldwide. But grace, David was beginning to realize, sometimes enabled the very systems it sought to transcend. Sarah Chen's intervention had created a ripple of tension through the first-class cabin. The FAA investigator stood with quiet authority, her credentials still visible, her green eyes moving between David, the flustered flight attendant, and the Richardsons who were now whispering frantically to each other. "Ms. Chun," David said, his voice carrying the warmth that had made him a natural leader, I appreciate your concern, but I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding. Sarah turned those intelligent eyes on him, and David felt something unexpected, a spark of recognition that went beyond the professional. There was something about the way she held herself, the careful control in her voice, that reminded him of his own learned composure in hostile environments. "Mister?" she prompted. "Wellington. David Wellington." Her eyebrows rose slightly. "The David Wellington? Wellington Innovations." "Guilty as charged." David's smile was genuine now, despite the circumstances. He found himself curious about this woman who'd stepped forward when no one else would. In his experience, people in positions of authority rarely risked their standing for strangers. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Janet, was growing more agitated by the second. "Look, both of you, this is really unnecessary. We're just trying to accommodate a valued customer who had a special request." "What kind of special request requires bumping a paying first-class passenger?" Sarah asked, her tone deceptively mild. "And I'm curious, what makes Mr. Richardson more valued than Mr. Wellington here?" Richardson himself finally spoke up, his face now a mottled red. "Now see here, I don't have to listen to this nonsense. I'm a Platinum Elite member with over 2 million miles on this airline. I specifically called ahead to request a front-row aisle seat for my wife's medical condition." David glanced at Mrs. Richardson, who was scrolling through her phone with apparent disinterest, showing no signs of any medical distress. But Richardson's mention of his status triggered something in David's memory. The Richardsons, he'd heard that name recently. It took a moment before it clicked. Richardson Industries, a mid-sized manufacturing company that Wellington Innovations had been courting for a green energy conversion contract. The same company whose CEO had made some very pointed comments about diversity hires and woke corporate policies during their initial meeting. The irony was delicious. "Your wife's medical condition," Sarah repeated, her professional skepticism evident. "And that condition requires specifically bumping another passenger from a seat he legitimately purchased?" Mrs. Richardson looked up from her phone with irritation. "I have anxiety about flying. I need to be in the front row, so I can get off quickly if I have a panic attack." "I see," Sarah said, making notes on her phone. "And this anxiety condition, it developed sometime between your original booking and boarding today?" David watched the exchange with growing fascination. Sarah Chin wasn't just an FAA investigator doing her job. She was someone who understood the nuances of discrimination, the coded language and manufactured justifications that masked prejudice. She was fighting this battle with the same strategic precision David used in corporate negotiations. But there was something else in her manner, a personal investment that went beyond professional duty. David found himself wondering what experiences had shaped her willingness to step into this particular fight. "Ms. Chun," he said quietly, "perhaps we could discuss this after the flight? I don't want to cause further disruption." She looked at him with surprise, as if she hadn't expected him to back down. "Mr. Wellington, with respect, backing down is how these situations continue to happen. Sometimes disruption is exactly what's needed." Her words hit David like a challenge. Here was a woman who was willing to risk professional complications to stand up for a stranger, while he, a man with the power to buy and sell this entire airline, was ready to quietly take his seat in coach to avoid making waves. The thought of his daughter's words came back to him. Sometimes you have to own them. "You're right," David said, his decision crystallizing. "Janet, I'll need to speak with your captain immediately." "Sir, that's really not necessary." "Oh, but it is." David's voice carried a new authority that made everyone in the vicinity go quiet. "You see, I think there might be some confusion about who exactly the valued customer is on this flight." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder that Sarah couldn't see the contents of, but David's slight smile suggested it contained something significant. Richardson was growing more belligerent. This is ridiculous. I'm not moving from this seat. I have important business in Chicago, a major deal that could be worth millions to this economy. Millions? David's smile widened. That's interesting. What kind of business are you in, Mr. Richardson? Manufacturing. Richardson Industries. We're about to close a huge contract for sustainable energy infrastructure. Not that it's any of your business. The cabin seemed to contract around them. David felt Sarah's eyes on him, saw her processing the undercurrents of this conversation. Other passengers were now openly staring, their phones discreetly pointed in their direction. Richardson Industries, David repeated thoughtfully. The same Richardson Industries that's been courting Wellington Innovations for a $2.4 billion green energy contract. The color drained completely from Richardson's face. The same contract, David continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the first-class cabin, that I was flying to Chicago to finalize. At least, I was until this unfortunate seating mix-up. The silence that followed was deafening. Richardson's mouth opened and closed wordlessly, while his wife had gone completely still, her phone forgotten in her lap. Janet, the flight attendant, looked like she wanted to disappear into the aircraft's upholstery. But it was Sarah's reaction that intrigued David most. Instead of satisfaction or amusement, he saw something deeper in her expression, a recognition of the complex dynamics at play, and perhaps an understanding of the choice David now faced. He could destroy Richardson professionally with a single phone call. He could make this incident a career-ending catastrophe for Janet and anyone else involved. He had the power to exact swift and decisive revenge. The question was, what kind of man did he want to be when he wielded that power? And more importantly, what kind of example did he want to set for his daughter and for the remarkable woman who had stepped forward to defend a stranger? The answer would define not just the next few minutes, but potentially the rest of his life. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom with practiced calm. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a slight delay due to an administrative matter. We appreciate your patience. David Wellington knew that administrative matter was him. Within minutes of his request to speak with the captain, the entire dynamic of Flight 447 had shifted. What had begun as a routine case of discriminatory seating had evolved into something far more complex, a perfect storm of corporate power, personal principle, and unexpected attraction. Captain James Morrison appeared in the first-class cabin like a man walking into a minefield. His weathered face carried the authority of 30 years in aviation, but his eyes held the wariness of someone who'd just learned that his crew had potentially violated federal anti-discrimination laws while bumping a passenger who could single-handedly destroy the airline's stock price. "Mr. Wellington," Captain Morrison said, extending his hand. "I'm Captain Morrison. I understand there's been some confusion about seating arrangements." David shook the captain's hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact. This was a man who dealt in facts, not corporate spin. "Captain, I appreciate you taking the time. There's been what I'd call a significant misunderstanding about passenger priority." Sarah Chin stepped forward, her FAA credentials still visible. "Captain, I'm Sarah Chin with the FAA. I witnessed what appeared to be discriminatory removal of a passenger from his lawfully purchased seat to accommodate another passenger's preference. I'm required to document this incident." The captain's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. In the span of 5 minutes, his routine flight to Chicago had become a federal case involving one of the most powerful black CEOs in America and an FAA investigator. David could see the calculations running behind the man's eyes: liability, careers, lawsuits, media coverage. But Richardson wasn't finished making things worse for himself. "Now wait just a minute," he blustered, heaving himself up from David's original seat. "I don't know who this guy thinks he is, but I'm a Platinum Elite member with over 2 million miles. I specifically requested this seat for my wife's medical condition, and I'm not about to be lectured by some Somewhat, Mr. Richardson? David's voice was silk over steel. The cabin went dead silent. Every passenger, every crew member, even the hum of the aircraft engines seemed muted as Richardson's face cycled through various shades of red. He'd been about to say something that would have ended his business career permanently, and everyone knew it. Sarah stepped smoothly into the silence. Mr. Richardson, you mentioned a medical condition requiring front-row seating. As an FAA investigator, I'm required to verify that proper medical accommodation procedures were followed. Do you have documentation from your wife's physician regarding this condition? Mrs. Richardson, who had been conspicuously silent while scrolling through her phone, looked up with panic. Oui, it's anxiety. You can't exactly get a doctor's note for anxiety. Actually, you can, Sarah replied calmly. Medical accommodation requests require proper documentation under federal regulations. Without it, preferential seating based on claimed medical needs could constitute fraud. David watched this exchange with growing admiration for Sarah's tactical precision. She wasn't just defending him, she was systematically dismantling Richardson's justifications while building an ironclad case. But more than that, he was drawn to her courage, her willingness to risk professional complications to stand up for what was right. Their eyes met across the cabin, and David felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a connection that transcended the immediate crisis. Sarah Chun was brilliant, fearless, and fighting beside him when she had every reason to stay uninvolved. Captain Morrison, David said, his decision crystallizing, I think we need to address the larger issue here. This isn't just about a seat mix-up. He opened his briefcase and withdrew a leather portfolio, removing several documents. These are my credentials as CEO of Wellington Innovations, documentation of my company's majority stake in Delta's parent corporation through our investment division, and a copy of the $2.4 billion contract I was flying to Chicago to finalize. The captain's face went ashen. Janet, the flight attendant, actually took a step backward, her hand flying to her mouth. But David wasn't finished. Mr. Richardson, you mentioned Richardson Industries is hoping to secure a sustainable energy contract. I believe you're referring to the Wellington Innovations contract, my company's contract. Richardson's complexion had moved beyond red into purple territory. You can't be serious. Dead serious, David replied. The same contract you were hoping to discuss with me over dinner tomorrow night in Chicago. The contract that would have provided your company with exclusive manufacturing rights for our Midwest expansion, creating an estimated 15,000 jobs and generating roughly $800 million in revenue for Richardson Industries over the next 5 years. The mathematical precision of corporate destruction hung in the air like smoke from a crash. Richardson had just discovered that the black man he'd demanded be removed from first class was not only the person who could make or break his company's future, but actually owned a controlling interest in the airline itself. "Oh my God," Mrs. Richardson whispered, her phone clattering to the floor. Sarah was watching David with fascination, seeing not just his business acumen, but the restraint he was showing. Another man might have exploded in anger or immediate retaliation. Instead, David was methodically laying out the facts, giving Richardson enough rope to hang himself while maintaining his own dignity. "Captain," Sarah said, "I need to document that proper procedures weren't followed here. This passenger was removed from his seat without cause, in apparent violation of federal anti-discrimination statutes, and the crew failed to verify medical accommodation claims." "Ms. Chen is right," David added. "But more concerning is the pattern this suggests. How many other passengers have been moved to accommodate preferred customers? How often does this airline prioritize certain passengers over others based on, shall we say, demographic considerations?" The implications were staggering. A federal investigation into systematic discrimination could cost the airline hundreds of millions in fines, lawsuits, and damaged reputation. Every crew member involved could lose their jobs. Richardson Industries would lose not just the Wellington contract, but likely face public relations disaster when the story inevitably broke. Captain Morrison found his voice. "Mr. Wellington, on behalf of Delta Airlines, I want to formally apologize for this completely unacceptable situation. Ms. Janet will be suspended pending a full investigation, and I assure you that—" "Captain," David interrupted gently, "I'm not interested in destroying careers or lives, but I am interested in systematic change." He looked around the cabin, his gaze lingering on Sarah's face. Something had shifted between them during this confrontation, a recognition of shared values, mutual respect, and an undeniable attraction that had nothing to do with the current crisis and everything to do with who they were as people. "I'm going to make you all an offer," David continued. "A chance to turn this disaster into something constructive. But first, I need to know if anyone here is genuinely committed to doing the right thing, not just avoiding consequences. What do you think David's offer will be? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between revenge and redemption? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below." Richardson was sweating profusely now, his earlier bluster completely evaporated. "Mr. Wellington, please, I didn't know. If I had known who you were—" "That's exactly the problem, Mr. Richardson," Sarah interjected, her voice sharp with controlled anger. "You didn't think it mattered who he was. You saw a black man in first class and assumed he didn't belong there." Her words hit like a physical blow. Richardson flinched, and even his wife looked ashamed. But David was focused on Sarah, impressed by her refusal to let Richardson off the hook with ignorance as an excuse. She understood that this wasn't about mistaken identity. It was about prejudice, pure and simple. "Miss Chun is absolutely right," David said. "The question now is, what are we going to do about it?" He looked around the cabin one more time, his gaze settling on each person involved. The terrified flight attendant, the mortified captain, the humiliated Richardsons, the uncomfortable passengers who had witnessed everything, and finally Sarah Chun, the remarkable woman who had transformed what could have been his quiet humiliation into an opportunity for real change. "Here's my offer," David said, and everyone leaned forward to hear words that would change multiple lives forever. The plane was still sitting at the gate, but David Wellington was about to take everyone aboard on a journey none of them had anticipated. "Here's what's going to happen," David said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had built an empire. "We're going to turn this flight into a teaching moment, and everyone here is going to be part of the solution." The first-class cabin had become a boardroom, with David Wellington as the unexpected chairman of a meeting no one had planned to attend. Captain Morrison stood at attention, Janet the flight attendant looked ready to cry, and the Richardsons appeared to be contemplating the end of their comfortable existence. But it was Sarah Chen's reaction that intrigued David most. Instead of relief that he was taking a constructive approach, he saw something sharper in her green eyes, skepticism, perhaps even disappointment. She was studying him with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex equation. "Mr. Wellington," she said carefully, "with respect, this isn't a corporate training seminar. Federal law was violated. There are procedures that must be followed." Their eyes locked across the cabin, and David felt the crackle of intellectual challenge. Sarah wasn't going to let him smooth this over with corporate goodwill and positive messaging. She wanted real accountability, real change, and she was willing to go head-to-head with him to get it. "You're absolutely right, Ms. Chun," David replied, and he saw surprise flicker across her face. "Which is why my first call will be to the FAA Regional Director to report this incident myself, with a full recommendation that Delta implement mandatory anti-bias training for all customer service personnel within 90 days. Sarah's eyebrows rose. "You're going to report your own airline?" "It's not my airline," David corrected. "I'm an investor with fiduciary responsibility to ensure the company operates ethically." Today's incident suggests systematic problems that need addressing. Captain Morrison cleared his throat. Mr. Wellington, what exactly are you proposing? David set his briefcase on the armrest of seat 2A, his original seat, which Richardson had finally vacated and was now standing awkwardly in the aisle. Captain, I want you to make an announcement to the entire aircraft. Tell them exactly what happened here, why it was wrong, and what steps Delta is taking to ensure it never happens again. Sir, that's not standard protocol. Standard protocol, Sarah interjected, her tone sharp, got us into this mess. Mr. Wellington, I have to ask, are you more interested in protecting the airline's reputation or addressing the discrimination that occurred? The question hung in the air like a challenge. David could feel the entire cabin watching him, waiting to see whether the powerful CEO would choose corporate damage control or genuine accountability. Richardson, who had been silent during this exchange, suddenly found his voice. Now wait just a minute. You can't just destroy people's reputations over a simple misunderstanding. I made a mistake, yes, but surely we can handle this privately. Mr. Richardson, David said, his voice colder now, you didn't make a mistake. You made a choice. The same choice you've probably made dozens of times in your business dealings, assuming that success belongs to people who look like you. The words hit Richardson like physical blows. His wife had gone completely pale, clutching her designer handbag as if it might anchor her to respectability. But David wasn't finished. The Wellington Innovations contract your company has been pursuing? It comes with diversity requirements. 50% of management positions filled by women and people of color within 2 years. Environmental sustainability benchmarks. Community investment mandates. Richardson's face cycled through confusion, then understanding, then horror. You can't be serious. Completely serious. Those requirements were non-negotiable from day one. Did your team not review the full contract terms? The silence that followed was answer enough. Richardson Industries had been so focused on the dollar signs that they'd glossed over the social responsibility clauses. Clauses that David had insisted on precisely because he knew companies like Richardson's needed structural incentives to embrace change. Sarah was watching this exchange with keen interest. Mr. Wellington, you're saying Richardson Industries agreed to diversity requirements without actually intending to meet them? That would be my assessment, Ms. Chin. Which raises questions about their fitness as a contractor. The corporate chess match was playing out in real time, but David found himself more interested in Sarah's reactions than Richardson's growing panic. She understood the implications immediately, saw how business contracts could be leveraged for social change, and appreciated the elegance of using economic pressure to drive ethical behavior. This is brilliant, she said quietly, and David felt a warmth that had nothing to do with business strategy. You approve of using economic leverage for social change? I approve of accountability, Sarah replied. Too many people think they can behave badly without consequences as long as money is involved. Their conversation was interrupted by Janet, the flight attendant, who had been whispering frantically with another crew member. Mr. Wellington, sir, we've contacted our corporate office. They're sending someone to meet the flight. Good, David said. Transparency is important. Captain Morrison, I still want that announcement made to the passengers. People deserve to know what happened here. Sir, that could cause significant disruption. Captain, Sarah interjected, her FAA authority clear in her voice. Federal regulations require that discrimination incidents be properly documented and reported. Passenger awareness is part of that process. David was beginning to understand that Sarah Chin wasn't just an FAA investigator. She was someone who had probably faced her own battles against systemic bias, who understood that change required uncomfortable conversations and public accountability. Ms. Chin, he said, may I ask what brought you into aviation oversight? Something flickered in her eyes, a shadow of old pain, quickly controlled. Someone needs to make sure the rules apply to everyone equally, regardless of who they are or how much money they have. There was a story there, David realized. A personal reason why Sarah Chun had chosen a career fighting institutional unfairness. He found himself wanting to know more about this remarkable woman who had stepped into his defense when she had nothing to gain and everything to lose. "Your parents were immigrants?" he guessed, reading the careful composure that came from growing up between worlds. "Taiwan," Sarah confirmed. "My father was an aerospace engineer who spent 20 years being passed over for promotions while watching less qualified colleagues advance. He taught me that excellence isn't enough if the system is rigged." David nodded, understanding completely. "My grandfather was a Pullman porter who saved every penny to send my father to college. 3 generations of fighting the same battles, just in different industries." The moment of connection was interrupted by Richardson's increasingly desperate voice. "Please, Mr. Wellington, surely we can work something out. I have employees, families depending on this contract." "Mr. Richardson," David said, his attention returning to the immediate crisis, "your employees deserve better leadership. Your community deserves a company that reflects its values. And your family deserves to be proud of how you conduct business." Sarah stepped closer, and David caught a hint of her perfume, something subtle and professional with an underlying warmth that matched her personality. "Mr. Wellington, I need to ask, are you planning to use this incident to terminate Richardson Industries' contract?" The question was professionally necessary, but David heard something else in her tone. She was testing him, wanting to see whether he would use his power for personal revenge or systemic change. "I'm planning to use this incident as a catalyst," David replied. "Richardson Industries can still earn the contract, but they'll have to prove they're committed to real change, not just diversity clauses on paper." Richardson's relief was visible, but Sarah looked intrigued rather than satisfied. "What kind of proof?" she asked. David smiled, feeling the thrill of a complex problem with an elegant solution. "Mr. Richardson is going to become the poster child for corporate transformation. Full diversity audit, public commitment to change, and personal accountability for results. And if he refuses? Then Richardson Industries joins the long list of companies that chose prejudice over profit." Sarah's smile was brilliant, and David felt something shift between them. A recognition that they were aligned not just on this immediate crisis, but on fundamental questions of justice and accountability. The attraction was undeniable now, crackling between them like electricity. But more than physical chemistry, David sensed an intellectual and ethical partnership that could change how both of them approached their work. "Captain Morrison," David said, never taking his eyes off Sarah, "let's make that announcement. It's time for everyone on this flight to understand what real accountability looks like." As the captain moved toward the intercom, David realized that the next few minutes would determine not just the fate of everyone involved in this incident, but potentially the course of his own future. Sarah Chun had walked into his life at 35,000 feet, and he had a feeling the landing was going to be the beginning of something extraordinary. The question was, would she see it the same way? Captain Morrison's voice echoed through the entire aircraft with uncommon gravity. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing a delay due to a serious incident that requires your attention and understanding." David watched Sarah's face as the announcement continued, noting how she listened with the intensity of someone who understood that words had power. The power to change minds, shift cultures, or perpetuate injustice. "A few minutes ago, one of our passengers was improperly removed from his first-class seat to accommodate another passenger's request. This action violated federal anti-discrimination laws and Delta Zone policies. I want every person on this aircraft to understand that such behavior is unacceptable and will not be tolerated." A murmur rippled through the plane, surprise, discomfort, and in some cases recognition. David could imagine passengers throughout the aircraft suddenly reevaluating what they'd witnessed during boarding, wondering if they'd been complicit in discrimination through their silence. But Richardson wasn't finished destroying himself. "This is ridiculous," he shouted loud enough for the entire first-class section to hear. "You're turning this into some kind of racial circus. I demand to speak to whoever's in charge here." The captain paused his announcement, and in that silence, Sarah Chen's voice cut through the tension like a surgeon's blade. "Mr. Richardson, you are speaking to the person in charge. David Wellington is the majority shareholder of this airline's parent company." The revelation hit the cabin like a thunderclap. Richardson's face went from red to gray in seconds, his wife gasped audibly, and even some of the other passengers turned to stare at David with new understanding. But Sarah wasn't finished delivering devastating truths. "He's also," she continued, her voice carrying clearly throughout first class, "the CEO whose company was about to award Richardson Industries the largest contract in your company's history. Until about 10 minutes ago." David felt a surge of admiration for Sarah's tactical brilliance, but also something deeper, a recognition that she was fighting beside him not just as an FAA investigator, but as someone who understood the stakes on a personal level. Richardson collapsed back into his seat, ironically the coach seat he should have occupied from the beginning, his face buried in his hands. His wife was quietly crying, apparently realizing that their comfortable lifestyle might be about to evaporate due to her husband's prejudice. "Ms. Chun," David said quietly, "that was beautifully executed." "Thank you. But we're not done yet." Sarah's green eyes held an intensity that made David's pulse quicken. "I need to ask you something privately." She gestured toward the front of the cabin, away from the other passengers. As they moved together, David became acutely aware of her presence. The confident way she moved, the sharp intelligence in her eyes, the subtle strength in her posture that spoke of someone who had fought many battles and won most of them. "David," she said, using his first name for the first time, "I need to know your real intentions here." "My intentions? You could destroy Richardson's company with a phone call. You could have Janet and half this crew fired before we land. You could turn this into a massive lawsuit that would cost Delta hundreds of millions." Sarah paused, studying his face. "Instead, you're talking about teaching moments and corporate transformation." "Why?" The question was more personal than professional, and David realized that Sarah was trying to understand not just his business strategy, but his character. Her opinion mattered to him in a way that surprised him with its intensity. "Because my daughter is watching," David said simply. Sarah's expression softened. "Your daughter?" "Zoe. She's 18, a freshman at Harvard, and she believes her father can change the world." David smiled, thinking of his brilliant, idealistic daughter. "She challenged me recently about being too accommodating, too willing to work within systems instead of transforming them. She said I couldn't change the world by being nice to broken systems." Smart girl. Terrifying smart. And she's right, to a point. But I've learned that destruction is easy. Creation is hard. Building something better than what you tear down, that's the real challenge. Sarah nodded slowly, and David saw something shift in her expression. Respect, perhaps, or recognition of shared values. "There's something else," David continued, his voice dropping to ensure privacy. "Something I haven't told anyone yet." Sarah stepped closer, and David caught that hint of her perfume again. The attraction between them was undeniable now, crackling in the small space between their bodies. "2 weeks ago, I found out my investment firm didn't just acquire shares in Delta's parent company. We acquired a controlling interest in Richardson Industries as well." Sarah's eyes widened. "You own Richardson's company?" 63%, through a subsidiary. Richardson doesn't know it yet. The acquisition went through a series of shell companies for tax purposes. I was planning to reveal it during our contract negotiations in Chicago. The implications were staggering. David Wellington didn't just have the power to deny Richardson Industries a contract. He literally owned the company. Richardson had been discriminating against his own ultimate boss. "My God," Sarah whispered. "You could fire him." "I could do more than that. I could dissolve the company entirely, liquidate assets, eliminate 1,500 jobs across 3 states. David's expression was serious now, the weight of absolute power evident in his eyes. "The question is, should I?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and David could practically see her brilliant mind processing the ethical complexities. Here was a man with the power to exact perfect revenge for a racist slight, but who was wrestling with the collateral damage that revenge might cause. "What does your daughter think you should do?" Sarah asked finally. "I haven't told her about this yet, but knowing Zoe, she'd probably say that real justice isn't about punishment. It's about preventing the next person from going through what I went through today." Sarah's smile was radiant. "I think I'd like your daughter. I think she'd like you too." David paused, then took a risk. "Sarah, can I ask you something personal?" "Shoot. Why did you step in? You could have ignored what was happening, filed a report later, kept your head down. Instead, you risked professional complications to defend a stranger. Why?" Sarah's composure faltered slightly, and David saw a flash of old pain cross her features. "Because 3 years ago, I was the passenger getting bumped. Not from first class, I couldn't afford first class then, but from a flight I needed to catch to get to my father's funeral." The revelation hit David like a physical blow. "Sarah, Asian woman, traveling alone, they assumed I was flexible, accommodating. The gate agent literally told me that people like me were usually more understanding about flight changes." Sarah's voice was steady, but David could see the controlled anger in her eyes. "I missed my father's funeral because I was too polite to fight back." David felt a surge of protective fury on her behalf, mixed with deep admiration for her strength. "That's why you became an investigator." "Partly. I decided that if the system was going to discriminate, at least there should be consequences." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both processing the weight of shared understanding. Two successful people who had achieved everything they'd worked for, yet still faced the casual prejudice that assumed they didn't belong in spaces of power and privilege. "Sarah," David said quietly, "would you consider having dinner with me in Chicago? Not for the investigation, not for business. Just because I'd like to get to know you better." Her smile was answer enough, but she said, "I'd like that. But first, we need to finish what we started here." "What do you have in mind?" Sarah's grin was positively predatory. "I think it's time for Mr. Richardson to learn about his new ownership structure. And I think the entire passenger manifest should understand what real accountability looks like." David felt his own smile matching hers. Sarah Chun was brilliant, beautiful, and absolutely ruthless when it came to fighting injustice. She was also, he was beginning to realize, exactly the partner he hadn't known he was looking for. "Ms. Chun," he said formally, extending his arm, "shall we go change some lives?" As they walked back toward the main cabin, David realized that this flight had already transformed from a routine business trip into something life-changing. The question was, how much more transformation could one airplane cabin handle? The answer, he suspected, was about to surprise everyone aboard Flight 447. The announcement that followed would later be called the most devastating 5 minutes in corporate aviation history. "Ladies and gentlemen," David's voice carried through the aircraft's intercom system with the authority of someone accustomed to addressing shareholders and world leaders. "This is David Wellington, CEO of Wellington Innovations and majority shareholder in this airline's parent company." The silence that followed was profound. Even the ambient noise of the aircraft seemed muted as hundreds of passengers processed what they were hearing. 10 minutes ago, I was removed from my first-class seat to accommodate another passenger's preference. Not due to overbooking, not due to mechanical issues, but because someone decided I didn't belong in the seat I had purchased. Sarah stood beside him at the front of first class, her FAA credentials visible, lending official weight to every word. She had suggested this approach: full transparency, complete accountability, and consequences that would ripple far beyond this single flight. The passenger who requested my removal was Mr. Charles Richardson, CEO of Richardson Industries. Mr. Richardson is currently aboard this flight, traveling to Chicago to finalize what he believed would be a $2.4 billion contract with my company. The murmur that ran through the aircraft was audible even over the intercom. David could see Richardson in his peripheral vision, slumped in a middle seat in coach, his face gray with the understanding that his world was collapsing in real time. But David wasn't finished. What Mr. Richardson doesn't know, what he's about to learn along with all of you, is that my investment firm acquired controlling interest in Richardson Industries 2 weeks ago. Mr. Richardson has just discriminated against his own boss. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Gasps, nervous laughter, and the distinctive sound of dozens of phones being activated as passengers realized they were witnessing corporate history in the making. Sarah stepped forward to the intercom. "This is Sarah Chun, Federal Aviation Administration. I'm documenting this incident as a clear violation of federal anti-discrimination statutes. But more importantly, I want every person on this aircraft to understand that discrimination has consequences, not just legal consequences, but human ones." Her voice carried a personal weight that resonated through the cabin. When we allow prejudice to go unchallenged, when we stay silent in the face of injustice, we become complicit in systems that diminish all of us. David watched Richardson's wife break down completely, her sobs audible even from the front of first class. Other passengers were staring, some with sympathy, others with barely concealed satisfaction at watching privilege get its comeuppance. But it was Janet, the flight attendant, whose reaction concerned David most. She stood frozen by the galley, her career clearly flashing before her eyes, tears streaming down her face as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. "However," David continued, his voice softening, "destruction is easy. Creation is hard. So here's what's going to happen." The cabin went silent again, everyone hanging on his next words. "Mr. Richardson will retain his position as CEO of Richardson Industries, but under new management structure and oversight. The company will implement comprehensive diversity training, restructure their hiring practices, and commit to measurable change within 90 days. Richardson's head snapped up, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time since the revelation. If Richardson Industries meets these benchmarks, they'll receive the Wellington contract as planned. If they don't, David paused meaningfully. Well, the free market has ways of correcting systemic problems. Sarah was watching David with undisguised admiration. This was leadership, not the petty revenge that power often enabled, but the strategic use of influence to create lasting change. But their moment of partnership was interrupted by an unexpected voice from the back of first class. "This is all very inspiring," said a woman's voice, crisp with authority, "but it's also highly irregular." Every head turned toward the speaker, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and a tailored suit that screamed corporate executive. She was rising from seat 5F, and there was something about her bearing that commanded immediate attention. "And you are?" Sarah asked, her investigator instincts immediately alert. "Victoria Hartwell, Senior Vice President of Operations for Delta Airlines. I was traveling incognito to observe customer service protocols." Her smile was sharp as a blade. Imagine my surprise. David felt the first chill of genuine concern. A senior Delta executive had witnessed the entire incident, not just Richardson's discrimination, but David's public revelation of his ownership stake, his demands for corporate announcements, and his systematic humiliation of a passenger. "Ms. Hartwell," David said carefully, I assume you're here to conduct damage control. Actually, Mr. Wellington, I'm here to inform you that your behavior today constitutes shareholder interference with airline operations. You've created a hostile environment for passengers, crew, and the company itself. The cabin temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Other passengers were following this exchange with the fascination of spectators at a tennis match, but David could sense the shift in dynamics. Victoria Hartwell wasn't intimidated by his ownership stake. She was prepared to fight him. Furthermore, Hartwell continued, your public revelation of confidential corporate information, your demands for operational changes, and your unauthorized use of aircraft communication systems violate multiple federal aviation regulations. Sarah stepped forward, her FAA credentials still visible. Ms. Hartwell, are you suggesting that documenting discrimination is somehow irregular? I'm suggesting, Ms. Chun, that Mr. Wellington has used his financial position to create a spectacle that prioritizes personal grievance over passenger safety and comfort. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Around them, David could see passengers beginning to shift uncomfortably. What had seemed like justice a few minutes earlier was now being reframed as corporate bullying. Hartwell wasn't finished. Mr. Wellington, effective immediately, Delta Airlines is invoking the change of control clauses in our shareholder agreements. Your behavior today demonstrates unfitness for stewardship of this company. David felt the ground shifting beneath him. Change of control clauses. He'd signed them without thinking, standard boilerplate that protected companies from hostile takeovers. But those same clauses could be used to strip him of voting rights if the board determined he was acting against company interests. You can't be serious, David said, but he could see from Hartwell's expression that she was deadly serious. Mr. Richardson's behavior was inappropriate, yes, but your response has been disproportionate and damaging. You've turned a private matter into a public relations nightmare, violated passenger privacy, and used corporate resources for personal revenge. Sarah was watching this exchange with a growing alarm. Ms. Hartwell, are you really going to punish someone for standing up to discrimination? I'm protecting this company from an investor who's demonstrated poor judgment and volatile decision-making. Hartwell's smile was coldly professional. Mr. Wellington, you'll be hearing from our legal department. The threat was clear. David's attempt to create systematic change was being reframed as corporate misconduct. His ownership stake, his power to force real transformation, was being challenged by executives who preferred quiet accommodation to public accountability. Richardson was watching this reversal with growing hope, realizing that his potential savior might have overplayed his hand. Other passengers were murmuring among themselves, and David could sense opinion shifting against him. Even worse, Sarah was being positioned as complicit in his supposed overreach. Her career with the FAA could be damaged by association with what Hartwell was characterizing as a personal vendetta disguised as civil rights enforcement. David, Sarah said quietly, using his first name despite the public setting, maybe we should. No, David interrupted, his voice firm. This is exactly what's wrong with the system. The moment someone stands up to discrimination, they get accused of overreaction, of making trouble, of being inappropriate. He looked around the cabin, meeting the eyes of passengers who had witnessed everything. How many of you have seen something like this happen before? How many of you have stayed quiet because it was easier, because you didn't want to make trouble? The silence was telling. David could see recognition in several faces, the uncomfortable memory of moments when they'd witnessed injustice and chosen inaction. Ms. Hartwell, David said, his voice carrying throughout the cabin, you're proving my point perfectly. When discrimination happens quietly, it's a regrettable incident. When someone fights back publicly, suddenly they're the problem. Have you ever been in a situation where standing up for what's right was twisted into being seen as the aggressor? How do you handle it when doing the right thing puts you at risk? Share your experiences in the comments. Hartwell's expression hardened. "Mr. Wellington, you have 1 minute to return to your assigned seat and cease this disruption, or I will have you removed from this aircraft." The ultimatum was clear, and David realized he was facing a choice that would define not just this moment, but potentially his entire future. He could back down, accept quiet resolution, and preserve his business relationships. Or he could continue fighting, risking everything he'd built for the principle that discrimination should have real consequences. Sarah was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Was she questioning his judgment? Worried about her own career? Or was she waiting to see what kind of man he truly was when everything was on the line? The entire cabin held its breath, waiting for David Wellington's response to the most important ultimatum of his life. David Wellington stood at the crossroads of his entire life, feeling the weight of every passenger's gaze, every career hanging in the balance, every principle he'd ever claimed to hold. The cabin was so quiet he could hear the subtle hum of electronics, the whisper of recycled air, the thunderous beating of his own heart. But it was Sarah's voice that cut through his moment of crisis. "Ms. Hartwell," she said, stepping forward with her FAA credentials held high, "before Mr. Wellington responds to your ultimatum, I need to inform you that you're currently interfering with a federal investigation." Hartwell's confident expression flickered. "I beg your pardon?" "Federal Aviation Regulation 91.3 gives me authority to document and investigate any incident involving passenger discrimination. Your attempt to silence the victim and witnesses constitutes obstruction of a federal investigation." David felt a surge of admiration and something deeper, a recognition that Sarah Chen was willing to risk her own career to stand beside him when everything was falling apart. "Furthermore," Sarah continued, her voice carrying the full weight of federal authority, "your characterization of Mr. Wellington's response as disproportionate raises questions about Delta's commitment to federal anti-discrimination compliance." But it wasn't Sarah's professional courage that gave David the strength to make his choice. It was the memory of his daughter's words echoing in his mind. "You can't change the world by being nice to broken systems, Dad. Sometimes you have to own them." David reached into his briefcase and pulled out his phone. "Ms. Hartwell, you mentioned change of control clauses. Let me save you some time." He speed-dialed a number that connected him to his chief legal counsel. "Marcus, it's David. I need you to execute option 7 immediately." He paused, listening. "Yes, the full nuclear option. Authorization code Wellington 77 Alpha." Hartwell frowned. "Mr. Wellington, what are you doing?" David ended the call and looked directly at the Delta executive with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Hartwell, I'm activating the poison pill provision in my investment contract. As of this moment, I'm transferring my majority stake in Delta's parent company to the Wellington Foundation for Corporate Justice, a nonprofit foundation dedicated to fighting discrimination in corporate America." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Sarah's eyes widened as she processed the implications. "What that means," David continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the aircraft, "is that I no longer have any financial interest in this airline. I can't be accused of using my ownership for personal benefit, because I no longer own anything." Hartwell's face had gone ashen. "You can't. That's billions of dollars." "That's correct. Roughly $3.2 billion, which the foundation will use to fund anti-discrimination lawsuits, corporate bias training, and systematic change across multiple industries." David's smile widened. "Including a comprehensive audit of Delta Airlines' passenger treatment protocols." The passengers around them were following this exchange with the stunned fascination of people witnessing history in the making. David Wellington had just given away billions of dollars to prove a point about justice. But Sarah understood something that the others missed. "David," she said quietly, "you're not just making a point. You're making a choice." "The biggest choice of my life," he confirmed, his eyes never leaving hers. Because some things matter more than money. Some battles matter more than business. Richardson, who had been watching this exchange from his coach seat, suddenly found his voice. "Mr. Wellington, please, you don't have to destroy yourself over this. I was wrong. I'll do anything you want, diversity training, restructuring, whatever it takes." David turned to face Richardson, and his expression was surprisingly gentle. "Mr. Richardson, this was never about destroying you. This was about saving you. Saving all of us from systems that diminish our humanity." He walked back toward Richardson's seat, and the entire cabin watched as the most powerful man on the aircraft approached the person who had tried to humiliate him. "Charles, may I call you Charles? You have 1,500 employees depending on you. You have a community that needs the jobs your company provides. You have grandchildren who will inherit the world we're building today." Richardson looked up with tears in his eyes. I know I messed up." "You didn't mess up," David said, his voice carrying both firmness and compassion. "You revealed who you are. The question now is, who do you want to become?" Sarah had moved closer, drawn by the remarkable scene unfolding before her. David Wellington, a man who had just sacrificed billions of dollars on principle, was offering redemption to the person who had wronged him. "I want to be better," Richardson whispered. "I want my grandchildren to be proud of their grandfather." "Then let's make that happen," David said, extending his hand. Richardson took it, and the handshake that followed was witnessed by everyone on Flight 447. A moment of genuine human connection in the midst of corporate warfare and federal investigations. But Victoria Hartwell wasn't finished fighting. "This is all very touching, Mr. Wellington, but your financial gymnastics don't change the fact that you've created chaos on this aircraft. I'm still having you removed." That's when Captain Morrison stepped forward, his weathered face set with determination. "Ms. Hartwell, with respect, I'm the captain of this aircraft, and I determine who stays and who goes." His voice carried 30 years of aviation authority. "What I witnessed today was a passenger being discriminated against, an FAA investigator doing her job, and a business leader choosing principle over profit." Morrison looked around the cabin, his gaze taking in every passenger, every crew member. "In 30 years of flying, I've seen a lot of corporate executives who talk about values. I've never seen one willing to give away billions of dollars to prove those values are real." The captain turned to face Hartwell directly. "Ma'am, if Delta Airlines has a problem with passengers standing up to discrimination, then Delta Airlines has bigger problems than Mr. Wellington." The crew members behind Morrison were nodding in agreement. Janet, the flight attendant who had started this entire incident, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "Captain, Mr. Wellington, Ms. Chun, I owe everyone an apology. What I did was wrong, and I knew it was wrong when I did it." She looked directly at David. "Sir, I let my assumptions override my training and my values. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I promise you this will never happen again." David felt Sarah's hand slip into his, a gesture of support that sent electricity through his entire body. "Janet," he said gently, "we all make mistakes. The question is what we learn from them." Sarah squeezed his hand, and David realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. She wasn't just impressed by his business acumen or his willingness to fight injustice. She was seeing the kind of man he was when everything was stripped away, when power and wealth and status didn't matter, and only character remained. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Morrison announced over the intercom, "we're going to be departing for Chicago momentarily. What happened on this flight today will be talked about for years to come. I hope it will be remembered as the day we all chose to be better." As the aircraft finally began to taxi toward the runway, David looked around the cabin one last time. Richardson was sitting quietly with his wife, both of them looking shaken but somehow hopeful. Hartwell was furiously typing on her phone, no doubt reporting to corporate headquarters that she'd just witnessed the most expensive act of corporate rebellion in aviation history. But it was Sarah's expression that mattered most to David. She was looking at him with something that transcended professional respect or personal attraction. She was seeing him as a partner, an equal, someone willing to sacrifice everything for the values they shared. "David," she said quietly, "what you did today, giving away billions of dollars to make a point about justice, that's either the most brilliant thing I've ever seen or the most insane." David's smile was genuine for the first time all day. "Sarah Chin, I'm hoping it's both." As Flight 447 lifted off toward Chicago, David Wellington realized that he wasn't just flying toward a business meeting anymore. He was flying toward a completely new life, one where he'd chosen principle over profit, justice over wealth, and quite possibly love over everything else. The question was, what would they all choose to do with this second chance? As Flight 447 reached cruising altitude over the heartland of America, the cabin had transformed into something unprecedented in aviation history, a flying tribunal where justice, redemption, and corporate transformation were being negotiated at 35,000 feet. David Wellington stood in the aisle of first class, no longer the humiliated passenger who had been asked to move, but something entirely new. A man who had just proved that principles could triumph over profit when someone was willing to pay the price. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying through the cabin with quiet authority, "what happened today doesn't end when we land in Chicago. It begins there." Sarah Chin stood beside him, her FAA credentials now representing something larger than regulatory oversight. They symbolized the federal government's commitment to ensuring that civil rights weren't negotiable, regardless of corporate interests or financial considerations. But it was Richardson's voice that surprised everyone. "Mr. Wellington," he called out from his coach seat, his voice carrying shame but also determination. "I'd like to make a public commitment, not just to you, but to everyone who witnessed what happened here today." David nodded for him to continue, and Richardson struggled to his feet, his face flushed with emotion. "I've spent 23 years building Richardson Industries, and in 10 minutes I almost destroyed it all because of my prejudice and ignorance." His voice cracked slightly. "My employees deserve better leadership. My community deserves better corporate citizenship. And my family deserves to be proud of the Richardson name again." He looked directly at David. "Sir, I accept your conditions for the contract, but I want to go further. I'm committing Richardson Industries to becoming a model for corporate diversity and inclusion. Full audit, external oversight, and public accountability for our progress." The cabin was silent, passengers hanging on every word of this extraordinary corporate confession. "Furthermore," Richardson continued, "I'm establishing the Richardson Wellington Scholarship Fund for minority students pursuing engineering and business degrees. Initial funding of $5 million, with annual commitments based on our contract performance." Sarah was watching this unfold with amazement. "Mr. Richardson, you understand that you're making these commitments in front of hundreds of witnesses, including an FAA investigator who will document everything?" "Yes, ma'am. I want witnesses. I want accountability. I want to make sure I can never slide back into the man I was an hour ago." David felt a surge of respect for Richardson's courage. It would have been easier to make private apologies and quiet reforms. Instead, he was choosing public accountability, the hardest path, but the only one that led to real change. "Charles," David said, using his first name intentionally, "I accept your commitment, but I have one additional requirement." Richardson nodded nervously. "Whatever you need. I want you to speak at the Wellington Foundation's first annual conference on corporate justice. Tell this story. All of it. Help other business leaders understand how easy it is to slip into discriminatory behavior and how much courage it takes to change." Yes. Yes, I'll do that." Victoria Hartwell, who had been quietly fuming in her seat, finally spoke up. "This is all very inspiring, but Delta Airlines still has legal and regulatory obligations." Mr. Wellington, your unauthorized use of aircraft communication systems. Ms. Hartwell, Captain Morrison interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades in aviation. I authorized all communications. As captain of this aircraft, passenger safety and civil rights compliance are my responsibility. Sarah stepped forward, her investigator's instincts fully engaged. Ms. Hartwell, I'm curious about Delta's internal policies regarding passenger discrimination. How many incidents like this have been reported in the past year? Hartwell's expression tightened. That information is confidential. Not anymore, David interjected with a slight smile. The Wellington Foundation now has majority voting rights in your parent company. Corporate transparency will be our first priority. The implications hit Hartwell like a physical blow. David had just positioned a non-profit foundation dedicated to fighting discrimination as the controlling shareholder of a major airline. Every policy decision, every executive hire, every customer service protocol would now be subject to oversight by people whose primary concern was civil rights rather than profit margins. You can't run an airline as a social justice experiment, Hartwell protested. Watch us, Sarah said, her smile matching David's. Federal regulations already require non-discriminatory treatment of passengers. We're just going to make sure those regulations are actually followed. David looked around the cabin, seeing faces that reflected the full spectrum of American society. Different races, ages, backgrounds, all united in this moment by their shared witness to something extraordinary. Everyone on this flight has become part of something bigger today, he announced. You've seen that discrimination has consequences, that courage can be contagious, and that real change requires real sacrifice. He paused, his gaze finding Sarah's face in the crowd. But most importantly, you've seen that when good people stand together, systems can be transformed. Sarah's smile was radiant. David, what you've done today, sacrificing billions of dollars to fight injustice, it's going to change everything. Not just for airlines, but for any industry where discrimination is tolerated because it's profitable. I didn't do it alone, David replied, his voice warm with genuine affection. Sarah Chun, federal investigator, showed me what real courage looks like when she stood up for a stranger she'd never met. The attraction between them was undeniable now, crackling in the space between their words. But more than romantic chemistry, there was a recognition of partnership. 2 people who shared not just values, but the willingness to sacrifice for those values. Janet, the flight attendant who had started this entire crisis, approached them hesitantly. Mr. Wellington, Ms. Chun, I know I don't deserve to ask this, but could I be part of the solution? I want to help train other crew members, help them understand how to recognize and prevent discrimination. David's expression softened. Janet, redemption isn't something you earn. It's something you choose every day, in every interaction. Yes, you can be part of the solution. As the aircraft began its descent into Chicago, passengers throughout the cabin were already sharing videos and photos on social media. Hashtag Flight 447 Justice was trending on Twitter. Major news networks were preparing breaking news segments. The stock market was reacting to news of Wellington's unprecedented corporate sacrifice. But David was focused on Sarah, on the way her eyes lit up when she talked about systemic change, on the strength in her voice when she defended the powerless, on the possibility that this extraordinary day might be the beginning of something even more extraordinary between them. Sarah, he said quietly, when this investigation is over, when the media circus dies down, when we've changed all the policies we can change, would you consider joining me? Not just for dinner, but as a partner in this foundation. Her answer was interrupted by the captain's voice over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach to Chicago O'Hare. The weather is clear, visibility unlimited, and we're expecting a smooth landing. Sarah looked out the window at the city lights spread below them like scattered diamonds, then back at David with a smile that made his heart race. "David Wellington," she said, "I thought you'd never ask. What do you think will happen when they land and this story breaks nationwide? Have you ever witnessed a moment where one person's courage inspired others to be better? Share your thoughts in the comments below." As Flight 447 touched down in Chicago, the passengers weren't just arriving at their destination. They were launching a movement that would reshape how corporate America thought about discrimination, accountability, and the price of justice. But for David and Sarah, the landing was just the beginning of their flight together into an uncertain but promising future. 6 months later, the ballroom of the Chicago Ritz-Carlton buzzed with anticipation as 500 of America's most influential business leaders gathered for the inaugural Wellington Foundation Corporate Justice Awards. Sarah Chin stood at the podium in an elegant navy dress that somehow managed to be both professional and breathtaking, her auburn hair catching the stage lights as she prepared to introduce the evening's keynote speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the same quiet authority that had transformed Flight 447. 6 months ago, routine business trip became a catalyst for nationwide change. Tonight, we celebrate not just the companies that have embraced that change, but the individuals who prove that courage is contagious. David Wellington watched from the wings, still amazed by how naturally Sarah had stepped into her role as executive director of the Wellington Foundation. Her transition from FAA investigator to corporate justice advocate had been seamless, driven by the same passion for fairness that had made her intervene on that fateful flight. The audience included CEOs who had voluntarily submitted to diversity audits, airline executives who had revolutionized their customer service protocols, and dozens of employees whose careers had been transformed by companies finally living up to their stated values. But it was the presence of Charles Richardson and his wife Margaret in the front row that made David smile most. Richardson Industries had become the poster child for corporate transformation, exceeding every diversity benchmark while simultaneously posting record profits. Charles had discovered that inclusion wasn't just morally right, it was good business. "Our first award tonight," Sarah continued, "goes to Delta Airlines for implementing the most comprehensive anti-discrimination training program in aviation history. Accepting the award is Captain James Morrison, whose leadership on Flight 447 reminded us that doing the right thing sometimes means taking personal risks." The applause was thunderous as Captain Morrison approached the podium. His speech was brief but powerful. "6 months ago, I thought my job was to fly planes safely. I learned that my real job is to ensure that every person who boards my aircraft is treated with dignity and respect. That's not just company policy, it's who we choose to be as human beings." As Morrison returned to his seat, Sarah's eyes found David's in the wings. The smile they shared carried 6 months of shared victories. The successful launches of corporate bias training programs in over 200 companies, the passage of stricter federal anti-discrimination penalties, and the quiet moments when they'd built something beautiful between them. "Our keynote speaker tonight," Sarah announced, "needs no introduction to anyone who's followed the transformation of corporate America over the past 6 months. But for me, he'll always be the man who taught me that real change requires real sacrifice. Please welcome David Wellington." David stepped onto the stage to a standing ovation, but his attention was focused entirely on Sarah as she handed him the microphone. 6 months of working together, of falling in love over late-night strategy sessions and early morning coffee meetings, of discovering that professional partnership could deepen into something profound and lasting. "Thank you," David said, waiting for the applause to subside. 6 months ago, I was removed from a first-class seat because someone decided I didn't belong there. Tonight, I want to talk about belonging, what it means, how we create it, and why it matters more than profit margins. He looked out at the audience, seeing faces that represented the full spectrum of American business leadership. The easy response to discrimination is anger. The profitable response is accommodation. But the transformative response is systematic change that ensures no one else goes through what you experienced. David's eyes found Charles Richardson in the audience. Charles Richardson and I have become unlikely partners in proving that redemption is possible when it's backed by concrete action. Richardson Industries hasn't just met our diversity requirements, they've shattered them. More importantly, they've discovered that inclusion drives innovation in ways that surprised everyone. Richardson stood, his face beaming with pride and humility. The man who had tried to have David removed from first class was now his staunchest advocate for corporate transformation. But individual success stories aren't enough, David continued. We need systematic change across entire industries. That's why I'm announcing tonight that the Wellington Foundation is expanding internationally. We're partnering with the European Union, with governments in Asia and Africa, with multinational corporations who understand that justice is a global imperative. The announcement sparked excited murmurs throughout the ballroom. The movement that had started on Flight 447 was becoming a worldwide initiative. However, David said, his voice taking on a more personal tone, the most important announcement I have to make tonight isn't about corporate policy or international partnerships. He looked directly at Sarah, who was standing at the side of the stage, her expression shifting from professional interest to personal curiosity. Sarah Chun, David said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent ballroom, you changed my life on an airplane at 35,000 feet. You showed me what courage looks like when you stand up for a stranger. You showed me what partnership means when you helped build this foundation. And you showed me what love feels like when you let me into your heart. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth as David reached into his jacket pocket. So in front of 500 witnesses, David continued, dropping to one knee on the stage, I'm asking you to continue this journey with me. Not just as my professional partner, not just as the love of my life, but as my wife. The diamond ring caught the stage lights as David opened the small velvet box, and the ballroom erupted in cheers and applause. But David only had eyes for Sarah as she walked toward him, tears streaming down her face, her smile brighter than all the lights in Chicago. David Wellington, she said, her voice carrying through the wireless microphone still clipped to her dress. You've already given away billions of dollars for justice. Are you really going to let me keep this ring for free? The laughter that rippled through the audience was warm and genuine as Sarah took the microphone from David's hand. Yes, she said simply, and the single word carried more power than all the corporate resolutions and policy changes they'd implemented together. As David slipped the ring onto her finger and stood to kiss his fiancée, the ballroom exploded in celebration. But Charles Richardson's voice carried over the applause. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we're witnessing the beginning of the most powerful partnership in corporate America. 1 year later, the wedding reception was held in the garden of David and Sarah's new home in Evanston, a sprawling Victorian that perfectly balanced David's love of classic architecture with Sarah's preference for functional elegance. The guest list read like a who's who of transformed corporate America: CEOs who had embraced change, employees whose careers had flourished under new diversity initiatives, and federal regulators who had seen discrimination complaints drop by 40% across the industries touched by the Wellington Foundation. But the most meaningful moment came during David's toast to his new wife. 1 year ago, he said, raising his glass to the assembled guests, Sarah and I were strangers on an airplane. Today, we're partners in every sense of the word, in marriage, in love, and in the ongoing fight for justice. Sarah stood beside him in her simple but elegant wedding dress, her hand intertwined with his, her smile radiant with happiness. The Wellington Foundation has now worked with over 800 companies across 6 continents, David continued. We've trained 100,000 employees in bias recognition and prevention. We've funded 500 discrimination lawsuits that resulted in real policy changes. And we've proven that doing the right thing is also good business. He paused, looking directly at Charles Richardson, who was seated at the family table with his wife and grandchildren. But our greatest success isn't measured in dollars or policy changes. It's measured in the fact that Charles Richardson's granddaughter just graduated as valedictorian from a class that's 60% women and minorities, a class that exists because her grandfather learned that diversity drives excellence. The applause was warm and sustained, but David wasn't finished. Sarah and I are expecting our first child in February, he announced, and the cheers that followed could be heard 3 blocks away. We're not sure if it's a boy or a girl, but we know one thing for certain. They'll grow up in a world where discrimination has consequences, where courage is rewarded, and where love really can conquer everything. As the reception wound down and guests began to leave, Janet, the former flight attendant, approached the newlyweds. She was now director of diversity training for Delta Airlines, having transformed her moment of shame into a career dedicated to preventing others from making the same mistakes. Mr. and Mrs. Wellington, she said, using Sarah's new name for the first time, I wanted to thank you both, not just for forgiving me, but for showing me how to turn a mistake into a mission. Janet, Sarah replied warmly, you didn't just implement change, you embodied it. You're proof that redemption is always possible when it's backed by consistent action. As the last guests departed, David and Sarah stood alone in their garden, still in their wedding clothes, looking out at the city lights of Chicago twinkling in the distance. Mrs. Wellington, David said, wrapping his arms around his wife from behind, do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't spoken up on that flight? Sarah leaned back against his chest, her hand resting on her still flat stomach where their child was growing. I try not to think about it. Some moments are too important to second guess. I love you, David whispered against her ear. I love you too. And David, thank you for showing me that changing the world isn't about grand gestures. It's about choosing love over fear, justice over comfort, and hope over cynicism, one decision at a time. As they stood together in their garden, with the city spread out before them and the future growing inside Sarah, David Wellington realized that the best journeys begin when you refuse to stay in your assigned seat, literally and metaphorically. Flight 447 had been scheduled to last 3 hours. The transformation it sparked would last forever.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It is as interesting and even more intriguing than you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.